Good morning. I'm giving the commentary on Lecture 17 of the Foundations of Esotericism. Sorry, it's been a few days. It's been a busy week for me. This lecture, Steiner, in a way, brings together the themes that we've been working with in the last few lectures into a synthesis. And therefore, it's one of those lectures in the cycle that, in a way, you have to just read to get its full impact, because there's so many themes and so many weavings that come together. I have put my own title to this lecture in 4 sets of 3s: intellect, imagination, intuition, consciousness, life, form, thought, speech, karma, spirit, Christ, Father, or third, second and first, logos. Steiner brings this idea of what we do with our hands, what we do with our speech, and what we do with our thoughts, together with how the first, second and third logos, which in Christian terminology are known as the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit, work into our being. So behind our Milky Way and the sun and the moon, there's a great intuitive spirit called the Father, or the first logos, which works into the physical, the ground of the world. The second is that behind everything, behind our word, there is the great spirit of imagination, calls him the Word or the Christ, the Spirit who stands behind everything and is still working today in our speech. This is called the Son or Christ, the Word. And then we have the third logos, which is known as the Holy Spirit. This is what we call the Spirit or the healing Spirit, and it takes place in our abstract thinking. So that's quite interesting. So this third spirit, the Spirit, is to work into our intellect. So at this point, Rudolf Steiner is starting to develop his threefold higher faculties, and he's using the word intellect for the world around us, and then imagination and intuition. Later on, he develops imagination, inspiration, and intuition. But I think the comment on this particular one is how the world of thought and the world of intellect works, because he's talking about how our karma, how our traces are actually really important to understand how abstract thoughts work. So that's quite interesting, because often in spiritual circles such as ours, we tend to poo-poo abstract intellectualism. And so I'd like to make a little comment on the abstract thinking. All consciousness existent in the world also lives in the human being in abstract thinking. So I'm just trying to find this particular comment where he talks about the abstract thinking being important. Through thought we leave behind traces in all spiritual beings that have brought about consciousness, and through the laws of nature. So thoughts would then be mere illusions if the perceptions had not arisen through thoughts. So perceptions leading to thoughts. When we think about our perceptions, we start to work on particular ways of that. But then we can also find the world of imagination and the world of intuition. So again, read this whole lecture through, because he brings things together in a very particular way. A person can affect their karma to the degree to which we ourselves possess intuition. We must receive it in the form of a great moral law. So we have intuition, or we can receive it in the form of great moral laws. He says in that way, religions, for example, are really important, because they give us the great moral laws, which we then need to develop into our own personal intuitions. So we have these things, but I'd like to make a comment on intellectual thinking, because we tend to kind of want spiritual thinking, but if we don't, Steiner develops this idea very much that we need to develop the strength of intellectual abstract thinking to be able to think in these higher perceptions. So as we develop the higher faculties of perception, so we have the physical senses, the 5 physical senses. Then we also have the soul organs, which Steiner develops into these 4-fold soul organs, which is our capacity to perceive, our thinking, our feeling, and our willing. But we also have spiritual senses. So a sensorium of spiritual senses, the first three of which he develops as imagination, not fantasy, crazy thoughts, but the world of image, the world of inspiration, where we hear the harmony of the spheres working into our thoughts, and then ultimately intuition. Later on, he also develops that there are higher organs of spiritual perception. So we have three sensoriums, a sensorium of the physical world, a sensorium for the soul world, and a sensorium for the spiritual world. Other traditions obviously have words for those as well. But we tend to think that intellectual thinking is abstract and only incorporates the physical world, which at first, of course, it is. But through the intellectual thinking and through the abstract thinking, we do actually have the capacity to build the concepts of the world around us. And it's in the building of the concepts that these other layers of revelation can take place around us. So this is why at this point he's talking about in our consciousness we work with the intellect, in our life forces we work with the imagination or the imago, and that's the Christ that works through our speech. So the Holy Spirit, or the third logos, works through our thought and expresses itself in the intellectual consciousness. In our speech, the Christ works in our life forces and in the revelation of image, and then the divine ground of the world, the Father God, works through karma and form in our intuitions. And we affect these things, if we remember from the previous lecture, that in our deed, in our karma, in our work with our hands, we take on the personal responsibility. That's working in the physical realm. And then in the life realm, through speech, we work upon creating future folk souls. And then ultimately, through our thoughts, we work on creating a future incarnation of the planet Earth and of the sun. So we have huge consequences with what we think, say, and do in the world. But through creating concepts with our intellectual thought, we can then include into that, through the intellectual work and through the abstract intellectual work, the soul and spiritual content of a thought. So yes, intellectual thinking can become destructive, it can be devoid of spirit and soul, and it can be purely abstract or purely materialistic intellect, where we go into a dualistic or an either-or kind of analysis of the world. Or we can use the intellect to rise above it, to use our reason to rise above the abstraction and the intellect, but not losing the intellectual faculty of discernment, of analysis and synthesis of ideas, so that the higher beings, the image and then the intuition, can reveal itself to us through these higher organs of perception. So at this point, the development of the intellect is really important, because through discernment, analysis and synthesis and the use of reason, we can start to build concepts out of our perceptions. And into these concepts, they are the vessel, or we could say the crucible upon which we can then open up alchemically the physical world to perceptions of the imago behind a concept, and then also the intuition or the higher moral truth behind any concept that we have. But without the intellectual concepts, that also becomes very, very difficult. So the intellectual work and the abstract intellectual work is very important. In fact, towards the end of his life, Steiner develops the fact that the future substantiality of future suns and future incarnations of the earth will be substantiated through the intellectual work of the human being. So we shouldn't poo-poo the intellectual work. What we really need to do is safeguard ourselves upon only materialistic intellectualization, where the abstract intellectualization has a tendency to drop into being regarding only what we can measure and weigh, and the materialistic aspect of it as the only capacity with the intellect. In fact, it takes us back to the criticism of Immanuel Kant, who sort of says that with our reason we reach a certain ceiling, with the intellect we reach a certain ceiling of our knowing, and the rest has to be given over to faith. And a certain part of that is correct, but Steiner is very clear that through the intellectual work of the human being, that ceiling, there is no ceiling. We can continue to develop faculties of cognition based upon the foundation of intellect, and especially abstract intellectualism. that is not purely based in materialistic dualism, as a lot of our scientific world is at the moment. And so we have to develop out of the intellectual concepts as the foundation upon which the imaginative and then the inspirative and the intuitive soul faculties come through. And that is a transformation through the work of the first, the second and the third logos, or in Christian, starting to develop an understanding of the Christian terminology of Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit in that as well. So a very interesting lecture where the threefoldness of the working of the past, the present, the future, and how that works in the human being at the present, and the transformation of these faculties from the physical senses to the soul senses and the spiritual senses, all come together in one lecture. Very, very important. But again, my focus on this critique would be to say, let's take another look at what becomes possible through the intellectual work of the human being, and not to limit it to intellectual or materialistic intellectualism, but also to see that it is through the intellect that the imaginative, the imago of the concept, and then the true being, the intuitive reality, and then also the harmony of the spheres can work through the concept of the intellect. So wishing you a good day, and I'm sorry it's been a while since I've made a comment. I'll try and make a few over the weekend to catch up. See you again.